They said her heart still beat 3 days after death. That's what the old record stated, scrawled in ink faded with time and guilt. Her name was Mary Collins, a Quaker healer known for prayer and kindness. They buried her with ceremony, with candles and hymns, but she wasn't in that coffin. Her bones were boiled, her skin preserved, her soul twisted into something holy, a relic, a tool, a product, hidden inside the altar of a church still standing today. This is not folklore. It's history, sealed in the Philadelphia Historical Society behind layers of red tape and institutional protection. You were never meant to hear this, but you are now. What if I told you that the line between worship and ritual sacrifice was blurred not in medieval Europe, but here, in the green, whispering hills of Pennsylvania? What if saints were not canonized by miracles, but harvested? From 1745 to 1792, 73 souls vanished from tightly knit communities. Men, women, children, each declared a saint, without a grave, without a name on stone. Local churches flourished, congregations swelled, miracles were whispered. And all of it, every ounce of divine power, was built on the work of a single family, the Whitmores. You see, when faith becomes commerce and sacredness is for sale, monsters are made in plain sight. Nathaniel Whitmore wasn't a preacher. He wasn't even particularly devout. He was a craftsman, a man who understood the power of belief better than any bishop, and he weaponized it. His family turned human bodies into holy symbols. Their victims became relics. Their relics became currency. And their currency reshaped the churches of early America. This story isn't just about horror. It's about control, how institutions manipulate memory, how truth gets buried beneath doctrine, and how evil survives when it's dressed in gold leaf and lit by candlelight. But this descent, this journey you're about to take, it's not for the faint-hearted. Because once you know what's hidden beneath the altar, behind the pulpits, and under centuries of hymns, you can never go back to who you were. Keep watching. You're about to meet the Whitmores, and they are not resting in peace. The Whitmore estate was nestled deep in the woods of Chester County, thick pines closing in like sentinels, the road winding like a serpent toward the house. Visitors described the property as solemnly beautiful, though no one could explain the weight they felt walking its grounds. Nathaniel Whitmore built it that way. He believed that holiness required fear. Reverence demanded unease. The house itself was 2 stories of stone and timber, strong, clean lines, with tall windows that let the light in during the day, and revealed nothing at night. Behind it stood the workshop. That's where it began. To the community, Nathaniel was a gifted artisan. He crafted chalices, altar boxes, communion plates, objects of devotion so ornate, so precise, that even the wealthiest congregations from Philadelphia to Virginia sought his work. Ministers praised his godly spirit. His wife, Elizabeth, soft-spoken and composed, hosted visiting clergy with warmth and grace. The children were well-behaved, quiet, diligent, perfect. But beneath that perfection was a silence so deep it bordered on the unnatural. People didn't laugh in the Whitmore home. No idle chatter, no music, no argument. Just the sound of carving tools, of boiling pots, of whispered prayers that didn't match any scripture. Because Nathaniel had discovered something that changed him. You see, he had spent years in England studying under a relic broker, one of the many shadow traders who trafficked in saints' bones stolen from crumbling European cathedrals. The trade was quiet, unspoken, profitable. But Nathaniel saw a flaw in the system. The supply was dying. The old saints were gone. Europe was closing its vaults. America, though. America was fertile, untapped, ripe for miracles. And who would question a relic's origin? When prayers were answered, did anyone care where the sacred fragment came from? He needed victims, but not just anyone. His wife Elizabeth developed what she called the discernment, a spiritual sense of who was worthy, who was usable. They didn't see it as murder. No, they saw it as elevation, a divine refinement. These weren't deaths. These were ascensions. Their first was Mary Collins, as you've heard, but she was only the beginning, because once you feed power with blood, it demands more. It whispers. It carves new commandments in the soul. And soon, Nathaniel wasn't waiting for the discernment. He was selecting for influence, for potential, for profit. The relics he sold weren't remnants of ancient saints. They were the freshly sanctified dead of local churches. You're not just learning history now. You're standing at the threshold of a truth the church has buried alive. By 1751, Nathaniel Whitmore was no longer a craftsman. He was a dealer in salvation. Churches came to him, not the congregations, but the men behind the pulpits, ministers, elders, bishops, the ones who knew that belief could be managed, strengthened, engineered. And Nathaniel offered them what no sermon could: proof. Miracles began to surface across the colonies, quietly at first, then with boldness. A child in Virginia cured of convulsions after touching a holy rib enclosed in glass. A widow in Trenton, who claimed her vision, returned after kneeling before a reliquary made by Whitmore's hand. And a minister in Maryland, who claimed divine insight after praying beside a chalice engraved with a hidden bone fragment. They called them blessings. But blessings have a price, and that price was flesh. The Whitmores had developed an internal system, a theology of butchery masked as divine purpose. Thomas, the eldest son, handled acquisitions. He would travel under the pretense of deliveries or worship, identifying the isolated, the devout, the unclaimed, people whose disappearance would cause a stir, but not a search. William, the youngest, was something else entirely. There was something wrong in him, something cold. The others still saw fragments of guilt. William? Nothing. He dissected with surgical precision, preserved with a kind of artistry that disturbed even his siblings. He said God spoke through the blade, that the human body, rightly treated, could echo with divine vibration. And it worked. The relics produced in that underground room, beneath the Whitmore workshop, were unlike anything found in Europe. They hummed. That's what multiple letters reported, a low vibration when held in prayer. The faithful swore they felt a heat, a pressure, a voice, as if the objects themselves demanded worship. And the churches? They didn't care where the power came from. They didn't ask, because the truth is, power forgives its own origins. Nathaniel offered a rule: never sell to the public, never explain the source. Only to clergy, only in secret. This created a hierarchy, those who held the relics, and those who followed blindly, never knowing their prayers were offered before bone shards stolen from their neighbors. And so the network grew. The Whitmores weren't just a family anymore. They were a cult of influence, embedded within the church itself. And as their wealth expanded, so too did their reach, not just in religious circles, but into government, into banking, into law. This was no longer about belief. It was about control. By 1760, the Whitmore relics were no longer whispered rumors. They were sacred treasures hidden in plain sight. Over 24 churches across the colonies held them, each relic encased in elaborately carved boxes, marked only with coded sigils Nathaniel had developed, a personal, perverse language of holiness. These sigils were never explained to the buyers, only hinted at. Old-world symbols, he called them, but they were more than decoration. They were part of the system. Every symbol corresponded to the manner of death, the type of body, and, most disturbingly, the spiritual potency determined by Elizabeth's discernment. The code was meticulous, calculated, and when decoded decades later by Daniel Foster, the apprentice who would betray them, it revealed something unholy. Each relic was ranked for efficacy. The more pain endured, the stronger the relic. Let that sink in. The churches weren't just buying sacred bones, they were buying measured suffering. Some ministers asked questions. Nathaniel was prepared. He spoke of mysticism, of European rites lost during the Reformation, of the early church's secret understanding of corporeal holiness. He cloaked murder in theology, and the ministers, hungry for miracles, desperate to grow flocks, nodded, agreed, paid. Because they weren't seeking God, they were seeking results, and that's when everything shifted. The Whitmores had proven a model. Spiritual control could be manufactured. Miracles could be bought and sold. Influence could be built, not through doctrine, but through fear wrapped in wonder. And like all systems of power, once built, it demanded expansion. It wasn't enough to craft a relic and sell it. They needed to monitor its effectiveness. Letters poured into the Whitmore estate, testimonies, healing accounts, sometimes complaints when miracles stopped. William began to study the decline in power over time. He postulated that the soul's residue degraded unless properly fed by worship. So they instructed churches to perform rituals, private ceremonies, prayers at certain times, with specific chants. They claimed it was to maintain sacred alignment. But what they were really doing was conditioning entire communities to obey unseen commands. Psychological control disguised as religious devotion. And when it worked, the congregation felt awe, obedience, unity, but never questioned why. It was behavioral engineering, 2 centuries before the term existed. Understand this. The Whitmores weren't just crafting relics. They were building a framework, a prototype of mass spiritual manipulation, using belief as a lever. And the clergy who participated? They weren't deceived. They were complicit. Still think this is just a story? Then tell me, when was the last time you questioned the hands that placed a symbol of holiness in front of you? In 1767, the Whitmores crossed a line even they hadn't intended. It began with a request from a wealthy church in Williamsburg, Virginia. Their rector, Reverend Josiah Blackwell, had heard rumors of a new kind of relic. Not just bone or flesh, but living memory. He wrote to Nathaniel Whitmore directly, offering a staggering sum of silver for what he called a relic imbued with the conscious echo of martyrdom. The Whitmores didn't hesitate. They began to experiment, William leading the charge. Using techniques derived from both indigenous embalming practices and stolen anatomical notes from a defrocked Dutch surgeon, he claimed he could preserve fragments of neural tissue while retaining the victim's final moments of terror. They called it echo binding. Thomas resisted, Sarah wept, Elizabeth prayed, but Nathaniel approved. On October 3, 1767, they abducted Elijah Brant, a mute boy of 13 who had lived on the edges of the Quaker settlement near Reading. He was known to wander the woods, collecting stones, humming tunelessly to himself. A sweet, forgotten soul. What they did to him in the workshop cellar took 9 hours. His relic, the first of its kind, was sent south, encased in a marble box lined with lambskin and sealed with molten wax mixed with his own blood. The accompanying instructions were clear. The relic was to be prayed over during childbirth and death vigils. Reverend Blackwell followed them exactly. Within months, letters came back. The relic didn't just inspire miracles, it spoke. Witnesses claimed to hear faint whispers during prayer, the sound of a boy humming, a voice crying softly when held by grieving mothers. Parishioners began visiting the church just to be near it. They called it the weeping box. But the cost? The rector became obsessed. His sermons turned darker. He refused communion. He kept the box on his person at all time, even sleeping beside it. By the winter of 1769, he was found dead in his chambers, fingernails torn, muttering a phrase over and over in a tongue no one could decipher. And the relic? It vanished, taken perhaps by someone who understood its true value or its true danger. This was more than commerce now, more than manipulation. The Whitmores had tapped into a deeper current, something beneath theology, a primal force that responded not to worship, but to fear, grief, and blood. And here's the question no one dares ask. Were these relics channels to the divine or doorways to something else? If you've made it this far, you're not the same. Type the phrase "echoes remain" twice in the comments to mark your awakening and to signal to others watching that you see what they don't. Let them wonder. Let them fear what comes next. By 1770, the Whitmore estate was no longer a sanctuary of craftsmanship. It was a cathedral of shadows. They had built something vast, more than a workshop, more than a home. It was now a compound, underground chambers tunneled into the earth, reinforced with stone and oak, a place where sound didn't carry, a place where the dead spoke louder than the living. Their clients? No longer just ministers and bishops. They had begun receiving coded letters from men of means, landowners, magistrates, even one signer of the Declaration itself. These men didn't care about relics for healing or worship. They wanted influence, insurance, and most dangerously, secrecy. And the Whitmores delivered. In 1772, a judge from New Jersey paid the family to craft a relic said to contain the breath of a dying saint. The Whitmores complied, sending a sealed reliquary to his estate. Weeks later, the judge's political opponents suffered a string of personal misfortunes. One committed suicide, another vanished en route to Boston. A third, his own brother, publicly confessed to a crime no one could prove he'd committed. Coincidence? No. It was proof of concept. The relics weren't just religious. They were psychological weapons. You see, belief isn't soft. It isn't sentimental. It's a lever, and the Whitmores learned to pull it with terrifying precision. They fed on fear, on guilt, on silent complicity. But beneath their control system, cracks were forming. Sarah Whitmore's journal entries grew fragmented. She described waking up to hear scratching beneath the floorboards. Even when no relics were stored there, she dreamed of children weeping through stone, of a hand reaching from inside a sealed box. And then there was William. He had begun speaking in riddles, keeping pieces of relics for himself. He claimed they were talking to him, teaching him things beyond preservation, things but the soul's geometry, as he called it. He once told Thomas, "We've been binding memory, but there are deeper organs, brother. Memory is only the surface." The family knew he had gone too far, but it was too late. Because the relics were no longer passive. They were evolving, reacting. And in some churches, parishioners started hearing the same dreams. Visions of red light in empty sanctuaries, screams behind choir walls. They thought it was divine. It wasn't. Power taken through blood demands blood in return. And something beneath those reliquaries somehow had begun to remember. The relics weren't just artifacts. They were seeds. By 1770, the Whitmore estate was no longer a sanctuary of craftsmanship. It was a cathedral of shadows. They had built something vast, more than a workshop, more than a home. It was now a compound, underground chambers tunneled into the earth, reinforced with stone and oak, a place where sound didn't carry, a place where the dead spoke louder than the living. Their clients? No longer just ministers and bishops. They had begun receiving coded letters from men of means, landowners, magistrates, even one signer of the Declaration itself. These men didn't care about relics for healing or worship. They wanted influence, insurance, and most dangerously, secrecy. And the Whitmores delivered. In 1772, a judge from New Jersey paid the family to craft a relic said to contain the breath of a dying saint. The Whitmores complied, sending a sealed reliquary to his estate. Weeks later, the judge's political opponents suffered a string of personal misfortunes. One committed suicide, another vanished en route to Boston. A third, his own brother, publicly confessed to a crime no one could prove he'd committed. Coincidence? No. It was proof of concept. The relics weren't just religious. They were psychological weapons. You see, belief isn't soft. It isn't sentimental. It's a lever, and the Whitmores learned to pull it with terrifying precision. They fed on fear, on guilt, on silent complicity. But beneath their control system, cracks were forming. Sarah Whitmore's journal entries grew fragmented. She described waking up to hear scratching beneath the floorboards. Even when no relics were stored there, she dreamed of children weeping through stone, of a hand reaching from inside a sealed box. And then there was William. He had begun speaking in riddles, keeping pieces of relics for himself. He claimed they were talking to him, teaching him things beyond preservation, things but the soul's geometry, as he called it. He once told Thomas, "We've been binding memory, but there are deeper organs, brother. Memory is only the surface." The family knew he had gone too far, but it was too late. Because the relics were no longer passive, they were evolving, reacting. And in some churches, parishioners started hearing the same dreams. Visions of red light in empty sanctuaries, screams behind choir walls. They thought it was divine. It wasn't. Power taken through blood demands blood in return. And something beneath those reliquaries somehow had begun to remember. The relics weren't just artifacts. They were seeds. Spring 1774. The journals go silent for 3 weeks. No records, no letters, no purchases or deliveries, just a gap. And when the entries resume, both Thomas and Sarah write with a tone changed forever. Not fear, not guilt. Something worse. Submission. It was during that spring that William sealed himself within the relic vault beneath the estate for 7 full days. No food, no light, no tools. Just the relics, their whispers, their vibrations, their cold hunger for attention. When he emerged, he was pale, trembling, and speaking incomplete phrases, in languages he had never studied. Ancient Greek, Aramaic, something else, unknown. His eyes were bloodshot. His skin smelled of myrrh and rot. And in his arms, he carried a box. Small, black, bound in iron. He would never speak of what was inside. He called it only the core. And after that, everything changed. The Whitmores stopped selling to outsiders. Commissions were refused, letters returned unopened. They severed ties with every church save a select few that had proven receptive. The relics already out in the world, left to their own devices, watched but no longer claimed. Because now, the Whitmores had a different mission, not profit, consolidation. William believed the relics were reaching a tipping point, that together, in close proximity, they would resonate, amplify one another. He spoke of a harmonic threshold, a moment where belief, grief, and pain would collapse into something pure. Thomas didn't believe him, but Sarah did, and so did Elizabeth. Nathaniel remained silent, haunted. His hands trembled during his last carvings. He muttered apologies to no one. And then they began calling them back. One by one, under the pretense of reconsecration, the Whitmores sent trusted agents to retrieve the most powerful relics from across the colonies. Many were never returned. Some churches stead. A few vanished in fires. None of the relics ever reappeared, except one, found buried beneath the altar of a ruined Quaker hall in Virginia, sealed in lead, scorched black from the inside. The sigil on its casing matched none of Nathaniel's known symbols. Carved instead were 2 Latin words, Domus Vox. The house speaks. And here's what no one tells you. There are churches today that still echo at night, that lock their sanctuaries not for safety, but silence. Because something was built beneath this country's holy places. Not faith, not truth, but architecture for something older. Something that wears religion like a skin. Autumn 1775. The colonies teetered on the edge of revolution. But at the Whitmore estate, another war had already begun, one not fought with muskets or flags, but with blood, bone, and the slow unraveling of sanity. Thomas Whitmore, the loyal son, finally broke. He had watched his family transform, watched their eyes go hollow, their prayers shift from God to something unnamed. He had obeyed, helped, killed. But the core changed everything. Whatever William had brought up from the vault, it wasn't an object. It was a presence. Thomas described it in his hidden confession. The air thickened around it. The box never opened, and yet we heard breathing, not from the box, from inside us. It felt like memory, someone else's, someone ancient, cruel, and waiting. He begged his father to destroy it. Nathaniel refused. William laughed. So Thomas ran. He escaped under cover of storm, stealing one of the original ledgers, coded with names, dates, and destinations. It was his only weapon, and he knew he couldn't go to the church. They were complicit. He couldn't go to the magistrates. They were buyers. So he hid it. Inside the wall of a prison in Philadelphia, where he later died awaiting trial for a fabricated crime. The ledger wouldn't be found until 1832 by a mason doing restoration work. The book smelled of ash and salt. Its ink bled in places, forming symbols long buried by time. But Thomas's warnings were clear. They believe they are collecting relics. They are collecting keys. I do not know what door they intend to open, only that it opens inward. And by then, it was too late. William had stopped creating new relics. He no longer needed raw material. He claimed the relics themselves, when placed in a specific sequence beneath the earth, could call back those used in their making. He called it reconstitution. He believed death was not the end of their usefulness, and that the soul's echo could be shaped, reused, refined. Sarah's final journal entry, written in blood, not ink, was one line: "The saints are waking." In 1777, a fire consumed part of the Whitmore compound. Neighbors claimed they heard screams that didn't sound human, not animal either, something else. The estate was sealed off. Official records claimed it was arson by political radicals. But the fire didn't reach the vault, and when investigators returned decades later, they found it untouched. Every relic still in place, still warm. Now ask yourself, why would a family do this? Because this was never about faith, never about God. It was about building a machine, a hidden, humming system of spiritual extraction, not for salvation, for power. And it's still humming. The war for independence ends. America is reborn. But beneath the soil of a fractured nation, the Whitmore machine still pulses, forgotten by history, but not by power. With the war's end came opportunity. Churches damaged by conflict needed rebuilding. Communities, shattered by years of bloodshed, longed for signs from heaven. And into that void crept the perfect product, sacred relics of the new saints, colonial martyrs whose stories were crafted by William Whitmore with surgical myth-making. They didn't need real victims anymore, because belief itself was now the body. The relics sold during this time were different, not just bone or skin, but documents, artifacts, bloodied scraps of uniform, each accompanied by carefully worded stories. Stories that fit a narrative, that soothed the national trauma, that bound together a nation of orphans and survivors. It wasn't just religious manipulation now. It was cultural engineering, and William understood something few others did. If you shape what people revere, you shape who they become. The Whitmores weren't just selling relics anymore. They were inserting symbols, coded trauma, into the architecture of the new republic. A blood-stained Bible passed down through 5 generations in Georgia, still used in oaths today. A communion plate in a New England church rumored to bleed during fasts. A child's rib kept in a cathedral vault in upstate New York, whispered to be the bone of a Revolutionary-era prophet who never existed. None of these were real, but all of them were believed. Because belief doesn't require truth. It only requires ritual, repetition, exposure, fear. The Whitmore system, by now entirely underground, wasn't just distributing relics. It was embedding symbols of control into the very rituals of American identity. Think about it. Every oath sworn over an heirloom, every prayer before a relic, every myth about a founding saint who heard the voice of God in the battlefield fog. These weren't accidents. They were programming points. And the churches? They let it happen. Because the relics brought people back. Filled pews, tightened tithes, And when the clergy began to whisper about strange dreams, about shadows moving inside locked sanctuaries, what did the Whitmores say? Pray harder. Because by then, it wasn't about God. It was about maintenance. Keeping the machine running, feeding whatever lived beneath the black box William called the core. And now you must ask, if they embedded their power in ritual, how much of what you worship was built to keep you asleep? By 1790, the Whitmore name had vanished from public life. The estate stood abandoned. Records were erased. Church logs lost in fire, but the relics remained. Scattered, sleeping, hidden beneath floorboards, inside altars, sewn into banners, encased in stone. Many still remain, not labeled, not recognized, but active, whispering, vibrating, hungry. And the truth? They no longer needed the Whitmores. Because what the family created was never meant to end with them, it was self-replicating, a virus of belief that embedded itself in ceremony, in architecture, in unquestioned reverence. Daniel Foster, the apprentice who exposed their secrets, wrote in his final letter, now sealed in the Philadelphia Historical Society, "These relics are not inert. They are not dead. They are patterns, ritual magnets. The symbols carved into them awaken something in the human brain, something older than language, older than morality. Not possession, alignment." He claimed certain relics, when placed within 66 feet of regular prayer, began to influence behavior. Not overtly, subtly, guilt deepened, fear increased, shame became holy, and authority became divine. Think about that. If you're told a relic heals you, but what it really does is bind your conscience to obedience, who benefits? Foster traced surviving relics to 11 churches still active today, and each one shares a common thread: congregations prone to spiritual ecstasy, but riddled with depression. Histories of abuse, always buried. An unshakable reverence for tradition, no matter how dark. Coincidence? Or the consequence of centuries of engineered submission? Ask yourself, why do certain religious spaces feel heavier than others? Why do you bow without understanding why? Because ritual is repetition, and repetition forms neural grooves, and grooves become prisons. That was the real brilliance of the Whitmore de Soul. And they didn't need to command you. They just needed you to participate. Stand here. Kneel now. Repeat this. Touch the box. Close your eyes. Obey. You were never worshiping. You were triggering. And every trigger, every kneel, every chant, every drop of oil was feeding it, feeding the system. And here's the worst part. Most of the relics weren't destroyed. They were donated to museums, private collections, historical societies. They're still here, still working. So if your hands start to tremble during prayer, if your dreams echo with humming voices, you haven't been chosen. You've been activated. This is where we stop pretending it's just history. This is where the mask burns away. Because the truth is, it was never just about the Whitmore family. They were architects, engineers, but the structure they built, others have continued. When William vanished in 1794, no body was found, no grave, just the core, sealed, humming, and removed by men whose names don't appear in any public record. And from that moment, the relic trade became something else. Private, institutional, global. By the early 1800s, strange artifacts, marked with variations of the Whitmore sigils, began appearing in Vatican vaults, Masonic libraries, underground Protestant sects. Some believe even the Smithsonian received pieces under false classifications. They were never catalogued, never shown. And why would they be? Because by then, the relics weren't just about controlling churches. They were about controlling populations. You've felt it. You've seen it. That strange weight in some cathedrals. The overwhelming urge to confess to someone you don't know. The quiet guilt that blooms at the edge of reverence. These are not accidents. They're residuals. Echoes of embedded trauma cycling through generations, kept alive by ceremony and blind repetition. Remember the phrase, repetition forms neural grooves. Grooves become prisons. Now apply that to national rituals, pledges, holidays, iconography, relics of founding fathers treated like saints, tears shed at objects that never bled, but were designed to make you submit. The Whitmores didn't invent this pattern, they reawakened it. Because this is the oldest control system in history. Take a body, inflict sacred suffering, encase the remains in gold, tell the masses it is holy. Repeat until obedience becomes culture. They called it reverence. But it was theft. Theft of will, theft of spirit, theft of your right to ask why. So what? So now, you've heard the whispers. You've stared into the box. There's no going back. You can't unsee this architecture. You can't unfeel the relics, hidden in plain sight, under altars, behind glass, in the bones of systems you were taught to trust. But you can choose. You can stay silent and hope they never look your way. Or you can speak. Type it one final time. Echoes remain. Echoes remain. Let the system see you. Let it know you're awake. Because the true relics aren't in churches anymore. They're in you, your memory, your instincts, your resistance, and they will only sleep if you do.